Okay, let's try and unpack this. Today we're diving deep into, well, a concept humanity's pondered for millennia. Destiny. It's a word we hear all the time, right? But what's really going on beneath the surface? What are the layers?
Exactly. There's so much packed into that one word.
And for this deep dive, we've got a really comprehensive source, basically, a detailed Wikipedia entry that pulls together history, philosophy, religion, you name it. Our mission, really, is to get past the everyday use of the word. We want to trace its history, see how it pops up everywhere, philosophy, religion, even politics and literature, and pull out the most interesting bits for you.
And I think that's so important because, the way we casually say, oh, it was destiny or it's fate, it often just smooths over how incredibly complex and, frankly, contested this whole idea is. We're hoping to show you just how varied the interpretations have been across different times and cultures. It's a really rich tapestry.
Definitely. So let's start right at the beginning. What are we fundamentally talking about? What do destiny and fate actually mean at their core, according to the source?
Well, at its heart, the source defines it as a predetermined course of events. Simple as that, really. Whether that applies to, say, your individual life or just events in general. And the word fate itself, it gives us a clue. Comes from the Latin fatum.
Fatum, meaning?
Meaning decree, prediction, destiny, fate. That idea of a decree, something laid down, is quite central.
A decree.
Right.
So something almost official sounding. And we do tend to use fate and destiny pretty much interchangeably now, don't we? But did they always mean the same thing? Does the source mention a difference?
It does point that out. Yeah, while they're often synonyms today, historically, and especially when you get into philosophy, fate and destiny could carry distinct shades of meaning. Interestingly, the source mentions the earliest hint of this idea might be on a cuneiform document. It talks about this mythical thing called the Tablet of Destinies.
Tablet of Destinies. Wow. What was that supposed to be?
Well, the thinking is it might have actually been related to a Sumerian political treaty, which is fascinating, right? It suggests the concept could have roots not just in the divine, but maybe in human political agreements too. Something given or decided upon.
Huh. So it could stem from actual human power structures, not just gods.
Right.
So traditionally, fate wasn't just random stuff happening. It was more like something enacted, a power.
Exactly. The traditional idea of fate describes it as a power or maybe an agency that actually predetermines things, your attributes, what happens to you. It's seen as decreed or given, and, it could swing either way, positively or negatively affecting your life.
Okay. But if it's decreed, where does chance come in? Because chance feels like the total opposite of a predetermined plan, doesn't it?
That's a great point. And yeah, the source tackles this. In Hellenistic times, this very randomness, the chaotic nature of chance, actually led to goddesses personifying luck. You had the Greek Taisha, she often represented the fortune, usually the good fortune of a whole city, and then the Roman Fortuna.
Ah, Fortuna and her wheel.
Exactly. The famous wheel. Blindly turned. It perfectly symbolizes that arbitrary random element within fate. And what's really interesting is that Christian writers, like Boethius, they actually kept using that image. And that had a big comeback during the Renaissance. So you've got this constant tension, fate as this clear decree, versus fate being swayed by this unpredictable spinning wheel of chance.
The wheel of fortune. Yeah, the image really sticks. Okay, so let's shift from those basic ideas into philosophy. This is where things usually get really dissected. How did the ancient Greeks handle destiny?
Well, this is where we see a major split emerge, which the source really highlights with the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Stoics, they generally believed that human actions were all part of a bigger divine plan, a universal fate. They kind of argued that, okay, theoretically, humans have free will.
There's always a but.
Our souls, our circumstances, everything about us was ultimately woven into this predetermined cosmic tapestry, part of that universal network of fate.
So you have free will, but only sort of, within the lines that fate has already drawn. It's tricky.
It is a bit tricky, yeah. It's trying to square the circle, maybe. Reconcile our feeling of making choices with this sense of a larger order. But then the Epicureans came along and just challenged that directly.
Yeah, so?
They flat out denied divine fate, just rejected it. Their view was much simpler. Our actions are voluntary. If they're rational, they come from us. So right there in ancient philosophy, you get this fundamental split. Is the path already laid out, or are our choices genuinely free?
That core tension, freedom versus predetermination feels like the central question that just keeps echoing down the centuries.
Yeah.
So jumping way ahead to modern philosophy, 19th century, the source says destiny and fate. started to mean slightly different things again.
Yes, especially when you look at thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Arthur Schopenhauer, he saw destiny as tied to what he called the will to live, like an inherent fundamental drive in everything. But, and this is the interesting part, he suggested this living fate, this drive, could actually be overridden through things like art, morality, and ascesis, practices of self-discipline and maybe detachment.
Overriding your fundamental nature through art or morality, that's quite something. It suggests fate isn't just some external bulldozer running you over.
Precisely. It brings agency back into the picture, even within a seemingly fated system. And then you get Nietzsche, who gives us amor fati.
Amor fati, love of fate.
Love of fate, yeah. And for Nietzsche, this wasn't about just passively accepting whatever happens. It's tied to his idea of the will to power. Amor fati is an active acceptance. It's affirming everything that happens, the good and the bad. By embracing it all, you kind of transform it. It becomes like a choice destiny. You choose to love what is necessary.
Loving what happens, choosing to affirm it. That really reframes fate, doesn't it? From something imposed on you to something you actively embrace. Wow. Okay, now, something often confused with fate, but different. Determinism. We need to clarify that.
Yes, this is a really key distinction the source makes. Determinism is the philosophical idea that all events, and that includes every single human thought, action, intention, everything, is causally determined by what came before. Basically, everything that happens is just the inevitable result of prior causes and conditions, like dominoes falling.
Okay, so dominoes falling, cause and effect. Fate is often seen as more like a decree, something given. What's the absolute core difference then?
The mechanism, really. Determinism isn't about gods or stars or decrees. It's purely about physical or logical cause and effect. A causes B causes C. That's it. Fate, traditionally at least, is seen as given or decreed, maybe by a god, maybe by some abstract power, often without spelling out the nuts and bolts of how it happens.
So caused inevitability versus decreed inevitability. That's a useful way to think about it. And the source mentions some key philosophers linked to determinism.
Yeah, it flags people like Robert Cain, Thomas Nagel, Roderick Chisholm, A.J. Ayer. They've all delved deep into determinism and what it means for things like free will.
It's striking how philosophy gives us these different lenses, doesn't it? Is it a plan? Is it just a cause and effect? Or can we actually carve out some agency? It really makes you reflect on your own life. Are you just reading a script? Or are you navigating this incredibly complex web of causes, or maybe actively steering?
Absolutely. And these aren't just abstract philosophical games. The source shows this concept popping up in other fields too, like psychology.
Psychology. How does destiny fit in there? Seems like a leap.
Well, the source mentions it briefly in the context of depth psychology. Thinkers like Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, even Leopold Sondy. They explored ideas related to fate, but more from the angle of the human psyche, looking at things like, unconscious drives, repeating patterns of behavior, maybe family histories, things that seem to guide or constrain us from within.
Ah, okay. So internal forces that can feel like fate, pushing us down certain roads without us even realizing it. That makes sense. And talking about deeply ingrained ideas, religion, destiny must be huge there.
Oh, absolutely central in many traditions, though again in hugely different ways. The ancient Sumerians, for instance, believed the gods predetermined an individual's destiny. The Babylonians had the god Nabu literally writing down the fates decreed by the head honcho gods, the Anunnaki.
So actual divine record keeping.
Pretty much. And in ancient Greece, you had the Moirai, the fates, but also the gods, especially Zeus, playing a big role in deciding and carrying out destiny.
So sometimes it's specific gods pulling the strings, not just some vague force.
Exactly. And then in the major monotheistic faiths, you see different takes again. Christianity has a whole spectrum of views, from a strong focus on human free will to complex ideas about predestination. Islam has the concept of qadar, the divine decree of God, which is pretty fundamental to understanding why things happen.
And Buddhism offers quite a different angle, doesn't it?
It does, yes. Buddhism looks at it through the lens of paikasamuppada, dependent arising. The idea that everything arises in dependence upon other things. All phenomena, including our actions and experiences, are caused by previous conditions. So it's not a personal decree from a specific god, but more like the universe operating according to interconnected laws of cause and effect. It leads to core ideas like impermanence and non-self. Our path is shaped by countless conditions, internal and external, not one fixed destiny.
Dependent arising, a kind of systems view of causality rather than a top-down decree, shows just how differently inevitability can be framed. Okay, let's change gears a bit. How does destiny play out in the very practical world of politics?
Well, here the source suggests it's often used more metaphorically, sometimes to explain events that seem way beyond human control, or maybe to give a sense of weight, of inevitability to a certain political direction. Otto von Bismarck, the German statesman, had that famous line about a politician needing to listen for God's footsteps and hang on to his coattails.
Implying that successful politics is about aligning with some larger, maybe inevitable, historical flow.
Exactly. Or think about General José de San Martín, the South American revolutionary leader. He said, "You will be what you must be, or you will be nothing." That's a powerful call to fulfill a necessary, almost fated role for a cause. Leo Tolstoy, in War and Peace, talks about the unconscious swarm life of mankind driving history, suggesting forces much bigger than any individual leader's choices.
Like history itself has a kind of destined momentum. And even Shakespeare used this politically.
Yes, in Julius Caesar, Brutus talks about a tide in the affairs of men. The idea is that there are these opportune moments that arrive almost as if fated, and you have to grab them or they're gone. So in politics, destiny becomes this handy way to talk about big historical forces, crucial turning points, or just the feeling that certain outcomes are bound to happen.
It's really interesting how that grand abstract idea gets pulled down to describe very concrete political moments or movements, gives them a narrative arc, maybe even a justification.
Yeah, it's revealing, isn't it, how invoking destiny, whether it's divine or just historical inevitability, can be used rhetorically. It can lend purpose, but maybe sometimes it also masks the real human choices and sheer luck involved.
Good point. Okay, and finally, let's turn to where probably most of us encounter these ideas most vividly. Literature. Destiny feels like a constant theme there.
Oh, absolutely. A massive recurring theme. Writers use it constantly to explore how humans react to the idea of a predetermined path. Do they fight it? Do they try to understand it? Accept it? The source points to the classic Greek tragedies, like Oedipus Rex.
Where he runs right into his fate by trying to avoid it. The ultimate irony.
Exactly, that classic trope. And the epics, too, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the gods and fate are always messing with things. You see similar stuff in ancient Chinese texts like the Liezi or Zhuangzi. And in Italy, Verdi's opera, well, the title says it all, La Forza del Destino, the force of destiny.
The force of destiny. Can't get much clearer than that. What about English literature?
Well, Shakespeare again, obviously. Macbeth is maybe the prime example, with the witch's prophecies kicking everything off. Thomas Hardy's novels, like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, his characters often seem crushed by just cruel twists of fate or sheer bad luck. Samuel Beckett's play Endgame traps its characters in this bleak, seemingly fated, inescapable situation. And that creepy short story by W.W. Jacobs, The Monkey's Paw.
Oh yeah, that one gives me chills. Wishes leading straight to disaster.
A perfect example of inescapable, tragic consequences tied to trying to control fate. And in American Lit, Thornton Wilder's The Bridge of San Luis Rey tackles it head-on. It examines the lives of people who die when a bridge collapses, asking, was it fate? Was it chance? Why them? Why then?
Probing that randomness versus pattern idea.
Exactly. And the German author Hermann Hesse comes back to destiny and finding one's path again and again in books like Siddhartha or The Glass Bead Game, and even in, modern pop culture. Think about Neo in The Matrix. His whole story revolves around this question. Is he the one? Is he the fated savior?
Right, the prophecy. All these stories seem to use destiny as a way to explore how much control we really have or don't have when things get tough.
Yeah, it's such a powerful engine for drama and for raising those big philosophical questions. The source also mentions Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics, which actually personify destiny. He's one of the Endless, depicted as this ancient, blind figure carrying a huge book chained to him, a book containing everything that ever was or ever will be. And he's the oldest of the Endless, suggesting destiny was there right from the start of everything.
Destiny as this foundational, maybe even oldest aspect of reality itself. Wow.
That's a really striking image. And then, of course, there's Jorge Luis Borges. For him, destiny is just everywhere. It's a concept he twists and turns and plays with constantly in his stories and poems, often in these really intricate, almost paradoxical ways.
Borges definitely seemed to take the idea to another level. What are some of the key examples the source highlights?
Okay, so in The Garden of Forking Paths, Borges plays with this idea of destiny not as one single track, but like an infinite labyrinth. Every possible choice you could make creates a new path, existing simultaneously. But here's the twist. Even with infinite possibilities branching out, the main character's actions still somehow feel funneled towards one inevitable conclusion. It's a paradox. endless choice leading to a fixed outcome.
A maze where all paths are real, but you're still fated to end up at one specific point. That messes with your head a bit. Definitely challenges the simple idea of
It
destiny.
really does. Another example is the lottery in Babylon. The story is basically a metaphor for fate and chance gone wild. It describes this society where literally everything in life is decided by a secret, all-powerful lottery. Who you marry, your job, when and how you die. All down to the lottery draw. Personal choice becomes completely meaningless. It's all this cosmic game of chance that dictates your fate.
Life is just a pre-drawn lottery ticket. That's pretty bleak, but what a powerful image for lack of control.
It is bleak. Then, in his poem Ajedrez, which means chess, he uses the chess pieces. They follow these fixed rules, moved by players they can't see. It's a symbol for us, humans, following our own predetermined paths, guided by some unseen hand playing us.
The great cosmic chess master pulling our strings.
Exactly. And Borges often comes back to the idea of a destined death. In Poema Conjectural, there's an historical figure facing his end. He kind of expected a peaceful death, but realizes his South American destiny, as he calls it, is actually a violent one. And strangely, he embraces it almost joyfully at the end. And in another story, The South, a man is dying prosaically in a hospital, but he hallucinates this heroic, dramatic death in a knife fight, a death he feels is more fitting, more like a chosen, fated end.
That's fascinating. Exploring how even the way we die can feel fated, and how our perception or acceptance of that fate changes everything. It shows destiny isn't just external events, is it? It's also tied up with our inner stories, our desires.
Absolutely. These Borges examples really stretch the whole concept: predetermination, chance, free will, the perception of it all. They push the boundaries.
Wow. Okay, we have covered so much ground here. I mean, from ancient Sumerian tablets and Greek philosophers arguing fate versus choice, all the way through religious beliefs, political slogans, and these incredible literary deep dives, especially thinking about Borges' labyrinths and lotteries. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And you see how the idea shifts, don't you? Sometimes it's rigid predetermination. Sometimes it's more like complex cause and effect. Sometimes it gets tangled up with pure chance. And sometimes, like with Nietzsche's Amor Fati, it becomes this active, chosen acceptance. But that key distinction holds. Fate often feels decreed or given, while determinism is strictly caused.
It definitely makes you stop and think, doesn't it? About your own life. Given how long humans have wrestled with this idea across so many cultures and fields, how much of your own path feels like it's already laid out, like you're just walking it? How much feels like it's purely down to the choices you make, day in, day out? Or maybe, just maybe, your experience is actually this fascinating, unpredictable, maybe even confusing mix of both. It's certainly something to mull over as you go about your day, navigating your own path, fated or otherwise.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're about to dig into something we do, well, basically every day, often without even thinking about it. And yet, it's actually one of the most complex and totally fascinating things humans have ever come up with: writing.
Yeah, it really is. And for this deep dive, we've got a great source to lean on, the Wikipedia article on writing. It gives us a fantastic overview. So our mission, if you like, is to kind of unravel what writing is fundamentally, why we do it, all the ways we use it now, demystify the different kinds of writing systems out there, and trace its incredible history. Where did it all begin? Expect some real aha moments, I think. Some surprising stuff about how writing literally builds civilization and, keeps changing.
Okay, so the big one first. What is writing? What are we actually talking about here? The source defines it pretty simply, but it's profound. It's the act of creating a persistent representation of language. So not just marks on a page. It needs a system, a set of symbols, the script and rules for how those symbols map onto a spoken language.
Right, and that connection to spoken language is key. Every written language, well, it comes from a spoken one, but interestingly, not the other way around. Think about it. Most languages spoken today actually don't have a written form, which tells you writing isn't just like a technical thing. It's cognitive, it's social. It involves how we think and how we connect.
Exactly. And the result, whether it's carved in stone, printed, or on your phone screen, that's the text. It's all about making language last, making it durable beyond just the moment you say it.
And that durability, stepping back a bit, is huge. Writing systems aren't languages themselves, right? They're tools.
Yeah.
Tools to encode language so someone else can read it, maybe miles away or, centuries later. Think about sending an email across the world or finding ancient knowledge in a library. Writing just, well, it extends what spoken language can do massively. Plus, it changes how we learn because it lets us externalize our thinking. Literally put thoughts down on paper or screen. That makes it way easier to look at them, build on them, rethink them. It's not just memory aid, it fundamentally reshaped, like our collective brain power, building knowledge over generations. Almost impossible without writing.
Yeah, that externalizing part is massive. Okay, so if that's the next really fascinating thing is why? Why did humans feel the need to invent this? Historically, it seems it wasn't just a nice extra. It grew out of sheer necessity as societies got bigger, more complex, economically and socially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Once it was invented, its uses just exploded. Tracking goods, keeping records of wealth, writing down histories, preserving culture, coding knowledge to textbooks, religious texts, scientific papers, and for running things. Crucial. Laws, census data, contracts, taxes, trade deals, treaties, it's all written. There's a quote from Charles Baserman that sums it up nicely. He talks about marking signs on stones, clay, paper, and now digital memories. Each more portable and rapidly traveling than the previous provided means for increasingly coordinated and extended action as well as memory across larger groups of people over time and space.
That's not just interesting, that's like the foundation of how we live now. I mean, how do you run an empire without written laws everyone can see? How do you unite people around common beliefs without shared texts? How do you build science without written observations others can check and build on? Writing didn't just help these things, it made them possible. It let societies operate on a scale way beyond human memory or just talking.
And for us, as individuals, the reasons are just as strong, maybe more relatable day to day. I mean, writing helps us get around our own memory limits. Think about your to-do list, right? Or a recipe, or instructions for putting furniture together. It's also vital for sharing ideas, essays, manifestos, whatever, for creativity, storytelling, keeping up with friends through letters or emails, and of course, personal stuff like diaries.
So it's both this huge societal infrastructure and a really personal tool for thinking and connecting. And the source really emphasizes that now, in the digital age, writing isn't fading away. If anything, it's more central. Email, social media, it's woven into daily life now, often right alongside, good old pen and paper.
That's totally right. A huge amount of everyday writing happens in most workplaces, certainly in developed countries. For lots of jobs, law, accounting, software development, HR writing isn't just part of the job. It basically is the job. Written documents are the main output. Even in jobs you might not think of as writing jobs, there's usually some record keeping, some emails. Most people write at least a bit at work.
Let's maybe look at a few specific areas today, because once you start noticing, it really is everywhere, like business and finance.
Oh, completely. Writing is everywhere in commerce. A simple example. A wholesaler gets a written request, sends out work orders, confirms shipping by email, writes an invoice, needs a signature. It's all text.
Yeah.
And on a bigger scale, modern finance, banking. It runs entirely on written rules, policies, reports, records, communications. Financial institutions rely heavily on written, well, now mostly digital records for everything. Their integrity depends on it.
Okay, and what about government and law?
Well, written constitutions are the blueprint for modern governments, right? Then you've got written rules for every department. Laws are drafted in writing by legislatures. The executive branch issues written regulations. Plus, governments keep written records on all of us: ID, births, deaths, licenses, taxes, criminal records. It's the invisible scaffolding holding society together.
Right, and science and scholarship. Seems obvious, but maybe break that down.
Yeah, research is almost always published in writing, articles, books. Arguments, experiments, data, all presented in writing. Getting funding means writing grant proposals. Data is recorded in lab notebooks. Drafts or preprints are shared in writing for feedback. And peer review. That's fundamentally a written conversation that decides what gets published. For a finding to become accepted knowledge, it needs to show up in review articles, textbooks, get cited by others. That whole process relies entirely on writing.
Which brings us to journalism. News reporting, mostly written, so central for, people staying informed in a democracy. Obviously, newspapers were huge for centuries. Now the whole industry is facing massive changes with how news is made and paid for online. New challenges, new ethical questions too, and then education.
Education. Yeah, formal schooling, from kindergarten right up to PhDs, is deeply tied to writing. Students read textbooks, they write constantly: exams, essays, notes, homework. And a lot of that writing isn't just about learning to write, it's how you learn the subject. Writing becomes a tool for actually understanding and absorbing the material.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the why, but maybe the most mind-bending part is the how. The sheer cleverness behind the different ways humans figured out how to capture language. Let's get into the different writing systems. It's amazing how many approaches there are.
Yeah, it really is ingenious. Broadly, we classify them by what units of language the symbols stand for. So first you have phonographies. These systems represent sounds, and they break down into two main types. Alphabets, where symbols stand for individual sounds, or phonemes like the P and B sounds making that different from bat, and syllabaries, where each symbol represents a whole syllable.
Okay, and the other main type?
That's logographies. These use symbols to represent units of meaning whole words, or meaningful parts of words, called morphemes. The big one still used today is Chinese characters, right, which are also used in Japanese, with adaptations. Historically, you had things like cuneiform and Maya script, too. What's neat about many logograms is they can actually contain clues about both the sound and the meaning within the symbol itself. They're quite rich.
Right. And syllabaries, again, symbols for syllables, usually like a consonant plus a vowel or maybe just a vowel sound.
Exactly. They work best for languages that have relatively simple syllable structures, like Japanese. You also mentioned Linear B from ancient Greece, and the Cherokee syllabary is another example. The key thing is, in a syllabary, syllables that sound similar phonetically, like ka and ki, are usually written with completely different unrelated symbols. Each syllable gets its own unique sign.
Gotcha. Which brings us to alphabets. Sets of symbols for both consonants and vowels. Ideally, one letter, one sound. But as anyone who speaks English knows, practice is often messier than theory.
Definitely. And even within alphabets, there are variations. You have abjads, sometimes called consonantaries. These systems basically only have letters for consonants. The earliest alphabets were actually abjads, likely influenced by Egyptian writing. Most are found in the Middle East, which kind of reflects how Semitic languages work, with less crucial vowel variation. It's like writing BK for book. The reader figures out the vowels from context. That's roughly an abjad. Then there are abugidas. You see these a lot in India and Southeast Asia. Here, vowels aren't separate letters. Instead, they're shown by little marks, diacritics, attached to the consonant symbol, or by slightly changing the consonant symbol's shape. So you might have a base symbol for ka, and a little tick or dot turns it into ki or ku. It's clever.
This is where the history gets really wild. Writing didn't just pop up everywhere at once. It seems to have first emerged in the early Bronze Age, specifically in Sumeria, in southern Mesopotamia, and the driver, purely practical needs. Trade and administration just got too complicated for memory alone. Sumerian cuneiform became the reliable way to track everything.
Right. Both Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs seem to have developed out of earlier, simpler proto-writing systems, somewhere between 3500 and 2900 BC. The first text we can really read date to around 2600 BC. In Mesopotamia, there's this fascinating theory by Denis Schmatt-Besserat connecting cuneiform back to little clay tokens used for counting goods, maybe as early as 8000 BC. These tokens gradually led to pressing symbols onto clay, then drawing them, then adding marks for quantity, eventually evolving into those distinct wedge shapes of cuneiform.
Wow, so those little clay balls were like the ancestors of spreadsheets. That's amazing. By about 2700 BC, cuneiform could represent syllables of spoken Sumerian. It became a full system, logograms, syllables, numbers, and it was so successful it got adapted for other languages like Akkadian, Hittite. And incredibly, the last known cuneiform texts are from the 1st century AD. It lasted for millennia.
Meanwhile, in Egypt, the earliest hieroglyphs we know of are from around the 33rd century BC. It was mainly logographic, picture-like symbols for words, but it also cleverly used some symbols phonetically, almost like an alphabet for certain sounds. Writing was super important for running the Egyptian empire, but literacy was kept within a small group of elite scribes. Hieroglyphs were complex, hard to learn.
Okay, now here's a point that just stops you in your tracks. Alphabetic writing, the kind most of us use. It seems it was only invented once in all of human history. Think about all the different ways people found to write things down, but only one group stumbled upon the truly efficient way to represent individual sounds. It really highlights what a massive cognitive leap that was, and it explains why that system unlocked widespread literacy like nothing else before.
Exactly. It happened around the mid-19th century BC, we think. The Proto-Sinaitic script. It emerged among Canaanite workers, possibly turquoise miners, in the Sinai Peninsula. We found about 30 inscriptions, quite crude, with symbols representing single consonant sounds. That's the absolute core idea of an alphabet. It took a while to catch on, though widespread use seems to start between the 12th and 9th centuries BC.
And from that single origin.
From there, the Phoenician alphabet developed directly from Proto-Sinaitic around 1050 BC. It was an abjad, remember, just consonants. Then came the real game changer for the West. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet around 800 BC, their big innovation, using some leftover Phoenician consonant symbols to consistently represent vowel sounds. That was it. That changed everything.
Back from Greek.
Well, one version of the Greek alphabet, the Cumae alphabet, led to the Etruscan alphabet. And from there, eventually, to the Latin alphabet that we're using right now to communicate this. Other branches from Greek include Cyrillic, used for Russian and other Slavic languages. And going back to Phoenician, it also gave rise to the Aramaic script, which is the ancestor of both Hebrew and Arabic scripts. It's this incredible interconnected family tree spreading across the globe.
We should probably give a quick nod to other key developments too, like in Mesoamerica.
Right, the Maya script. It's the best developed, the only fully deciphered system from before Columbus. Dates back to the 3rd century BC. It used a really interesting mix of logograms and symbols for syllables. And in China, the earliest writing we have is from around 1200 BC, found on oracle bones used for divination. Also in Iran, another very early system, Proto-Elamite, popped up around 3200 BC, probably influenced by early Mesopotamian proto-cuneiform.
And we mentioned religious texts earlier. Their role seems pretty significant too.
Definitely. In many cultures, religious texts were among the very first things written down widely, sometimes the only things written in a particular language for a long time. And many are still incredibly popular today. It just shows writing's power to unify beliefs and communities over centuries.
So we've really covered a lot of ground, from the basic idea of making language permanent to all the reasons we do it: societal, personal, its absolute ubiquity today, especially in work. Then the incredible variety of systems people invented, and finally tracing that amazing journey back to its ancient roots, particularly that single invention of the alphabet. It just hammers home how fundamental writing is, even when we don't notice it, from, our grocery lists all the way up to global finance.
So what's the big takeaway here for you listening? I think it's that writing allows us to, again, externalize our thinking, to transmit knowledge across time and space in a way that truly extends the human mind. And that single invention of the alphabet, its impact in just spreading ideas and knowledge far and wide, you really can't overstate it. Which leaves us with a maybe provocative thought. Most spoken languages aren't written down, even today. So what does the act of creating a persistent representation of language actually change about a society? About how individuals think, remember, connect? Try to imagine a world completely without writing. What gets lost? What kinds of knowledge? What connections? What collective memory just wouldn't exist?
That's a really powerful question to ponder. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring this incredible, truly world-shaping human invention on your own. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to tackle a word that gets thrown around a lot, often not in a good way: hedonism. Most of us, when we hear it, we probably picture something like nonstop parties, instant gratification.
Yeah, maybe that phrase, sex and drugs without concern for long-term consequences,
Yeah.
kind of sums up the common image.
Exactly. That popular idea, sometimes people call it folk hedonism. It's really just, scratching the surface.
It really is.
So our mission today is to push past that narrow view and really dive into hedonism as this, rich and pretty complex family of philosophical views that prioritize pleasure.
Okay, let's unpack this.
And it's fascinating because this isn't some new fad. This concept, it's been debated for literally millennia, ancient Greece right up to today.
Wow, millennia.
Yeah, and it has these really deep implications, not just in philosophy, but touching on psychology, economics, even how we think about things like animal welfare.
So our goal here is to help you get a quick, but hopefully pretty thorough grasp of what hedonism really means in all its different flavors, and maybe why these old ideas still matter so much.
Okay, so let's start with the basics: pleasure and pain. We all kind of get that intuitively, right? But how do philosophers and psychologists actually nail down these terms when they're talking about hedonism? Is it just like physical stuff?
That's a really key question, because hedonists usually take a much wider view than just bodily feelings.
Okay.
While, traditional views maybe focus more there, contemporary philosophy broadens it out a lot. pleasure can cover basically any positive experience.
Any.
Yeah, like the simple joy of watching a beautiful sunset, or the satisfaction you get from solving a really tough problem, or just feeling connected to friends.
Mhm.
And conversely, pain isn't just physical hurt. It covers any negative experience. It could be sadness, frustration, boredom, loss.
So it's more about attraction and aversion, like what we naturally move towards or pull away from.
Exactly. It's about these attitudes of attraction or aversion we have towards experiences. And these feelings exist on a whole spectrum, from really negative through neutral, all the way up to intensely positive.
Okay, that's a really broad definition. The joy of a sunset, the warmth of friendship. But my first thought is, if it's that wide-ranging, how on earth do you even start to measure something so subjective, so personal?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the thorniest issues. And people have tried, both in philosophy and psychology.
Sure.
Well, a common way in psychology is using self-report questionnaires, asking people to rate their experiences on a scale, maybe like a 9-point scale.
Right, I've seen those.
Yeah, rating immediate feelings or looking back. But just like you said, there are big problems. It's super subjective. And comparing my 7 to your 7 on some artificial scale, it's tricky.
Yeah, definitely.
People also look at neuroimaging, like fMRI scans, trying to find brain correlates of pleasure and pain.
Yeah.
But, the science is still pretty early days in terms of precise measurement. What's fascinating here is how they try to make something so subjective, so measurable. Like Jeremy Bentham, back in the day, he had this incredibly ambitious idea.
Oh, yeah.
He came up with what he called the hedonistic calculus. He literally tried to create a formula for happiness.
A formula. Seriously.
Yeah. He suggested we could weigh pleasures based on things like their intensity, their duration, how likely they were to happen, even their knock-on effects, like how many other pleasures they might lead to. Imagine trying to assign numbers to joy.
Wow, a hedonistic calculus.
Yeah.
That is ambitious. Okay, so if pleasure is this broad, kind of slippery thing, how do different philosophical views actually handle it? It sounds like hedonism isn't just one single idea then.
Exactly right. It's really more like a family of related views.
Yeah.
And they usually get grouped into 3 main types, depending on what they're focusing on. Human
Indeed.
motivation, what we value, or how we ought to act morally.
Okay, 3 types. Let's break them down.
So first up, you've got psychological hedonism. This isn't about what should be. It's an empirical claim about how things are. It suggests that all human actions, like fundamentally, are driven by seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. It's often seen as a type of egoism, the idea that deep down, we're always acting for our own benefit.
So even helping someone else.
According to this view, yeah. You'd only do it if you expected some kind of personal payoff, maybe feeling good about yourself or avoiding guilt or hoping for a favor back. Thomas Hobbes was a big proponent of this idea.
But what about, there seem to be counterexamples, right? Like soldiers jumping on grenades to save their buddies, or parents who genuinely seem to want their kids to be happy, even if it makes their own lives harder.
Exactly. Those are the classic critiques.
Yeah.
Apparent altruism is a big challenge. Or even think about someone wanting to be famous after they die. How does that bring them pleasure right now? Psychological hedonism struggles to explain those convincingly.
Right. Okay, so that's one type. What's next?
Second is axiological hedonism.
Yeah.
Now, axiological just means relating to value. So this view is about what is actually good or valuable. And it claims that pleasure is the only thing that has intrinsic value.
Intrinsic value means...
Meaning it's good in itself just for its own sake, not because of what it leads to. Like money has instrumental value, right? It's useful for buying things.
Sure.
But axiological hedonism says only pleasure is good like that, intrinsically. Everything else, money, health, knowledge, is only valuable because it helps us get pleasure or avoid pain.
Gotcha.
And a specific version of this is prudential hedonism. That focuses just on individual well-being, saying pleasure and pain are the only things that make someone's life go better or worse for them.
Okay.
Within this, there's another split. You have quantitative hedonism, which basically just counts the amount of pleasure intensity times duration, like Bentham.
Right.
But then there's qualitative hedonism, most famously pushed by John Stuart Mill. He argued that the quality of pleasure matters too.
Quality. How so?
Well, Mill thought that some pleasures are just inherently better or higher than others, like the pleasures of the mind, reading poetry, doing philosophy, appreciating art. He thought those were qualitatively superior to purely bodily pleasures, like eating or drinking, even if the bodily ones felt more intense sometimes.
Interesting. So a little bit of intellectual pleasure could outweigh a lot of, say, basic physical gratification?
That was Mill's idea, yeah. Famously, he said it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied.
Right. Okay, so on this idea of pleasure being the only value, I was reading about this thought experiment, Robert Nozick's experience machine.
Ah, yes. The experience machine. Classic.
It really made me stop and think. It asks, if you could plug into this machine that would give you any experience you wanted, perfect pleasure, constant bliss for your whole life, but you'd know it wasn't real, it was all simulated, would you do it?
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, what does our answer tell us about what we really value?
It's such a powerful challenge, isn't it? Because it directly hits axiological hedonism. Most people, when they really think about it, hesitate. They wouldn't plug in.
Yeah, I think I probably wouldn't either.
And that hesitation suggests we value things other than just the feeling of pleasure itself. We seem to value, well, authenticity, real experiences,
Yeah.
genuine achievement, actually doing things and connecting with the real world, not just having the sensation of doing them.
So pleasure isn't the only thing with intrinsic value for us.
That's what Nozick's argument suggests.
Yeah.
And there are others too. G.E. Moore had another famous thought experiment. He asked us to imagine two worlds.
Okay.
One is incredibly beautiful, just stunningly gorgeous, but completely empty, no one there to see it. The other world is just a disgusting heap of filth, also empty. Moore argued the beautiful world is still better, even with no one experiencing it.
Huh. So beauty itself might have value.
Exactly. His point was that value might exist in things beyond conscious experiences like pleasure. It challenges the idea that pleasure is the sole source of all value.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've had psychological, axiological. What's the third type?
The third main branch is ethical hedonism.
Yeah.
This moves from what is psychological or what is valuable, axiological, to what we should do, morality.
Right, the ought.
Yes. Ethical hedonism says that the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain should be our highest moral goals. Things like duty, rights, justice. They're only important insofar as they affect pleasure and pain overall.
Okay. And does that split too?
It does. The two main forms are quite different. First, there's egoistic hedonism. This says each person should morally pursue their own pleasure above all else.
That sounds problematic. Like it could justify hurting others if it benefits me.
Potentially, yes. If maximizing my net pleasure involves causing pain to others, this view might say I'm morally obligated to do it. It's not a very popular view for obvious reasons.
I can see why. What's the other form?
The other, much more influential form is utilitarian hedonism. This is basically classical utilitarianism.
Bentham Milligan.
Exactly. This view says we should act to maximize the total sum of happiness, pleasure minus pain, for everyone affected by our actions. It's the famous principle of the greatest good for the greatest number.
So it's not just about my pleasure, but everyone's.
Precisely. It's impartial. My happiness counts, but no more than anyone else's. A contemporary example is someone like Peter Singer.
Okay.
He uses this kind of reasoning to argue that people in affluent countries have a strong moral obligation to donate significant portions of their income to effective charities.
Because that money creates more happiness elsewhere.
Exactly. The same amount of money can often produce far more well-being or alleviate far more suffering for someone in extreme poverty than it can by buying, say, luxury goods for someone already well off.
Right. That makes sense. But are there criticisms of utilitarian hedonism, too?
Oh, absolutely. One major criticism is that it can be incredibly demanding. If I always have to act to maximize overall happiness, maybe I should never spend money on myself or even relax if I could be doing something more useful for the greater good.
Yeah, that sounds exhausting.
Another big worry is about justice and rights. Could utilitarianism justify sacrificing an innocent person if it somehow led to greater overall happiness for many others? Some critics argue it could, which seems morally wrong to many people. Plus, just practically figuring out all the consequences of our actions for everyone's happiness is, well, basically impossible.
Okay, so lots of different takes on hedonism there. But let's shift gears a bit. Even if we kind of agree pleasure is good, or maybe even the main goal, actually achieving lasting happiness seems tricky, right? It feels like it's not as simple as just deciding, I'm going to be happy now.
Oh, definitely not. Psychology throws up some really interesting roadblocks or maybe paradoxes.
Like what?
Well, first, there's something called the paradox of hedonism.
Paradox.
Yeah, the core idea is that directly aiming for pleasure, constantly trying to make yourself happy, is often counterproductive, kind of backfires. Think about it. If you're always monitoring yourself, asking, am I happy yet? Is this fun enough? So you often end up spoiling the experience. Happiness or pleasure often seems to arise as a byproduct when you're absorbed in something else. Could be meaningful work, a hobby, helping someone, connecting with nature.
Right, like focusing too hard on trying to have fun at a party can make it less fun.
Exactly. Or think of a tennis player. If they're solely focused on the feeling of enjoyment with every shot, they might get frustrated. But if they focus on playing well, on the challenge, on the flow of the game, the enjoyment often just happens. Pleasure sneaks in the side door when you're not looking directly at it.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. What's the other barrier?
The second big one is known as the hedonic treadmill.
Treadmill, like running in place.
Kinda, yeah. This is the theory backed by quite a bit of psychological research, that people tend to return to a relatively stable baseline level of happiness, even after major life events, positive or negative.
So, like winning the lottery doesn't make you permanently happier.
Well, it gives you a boost, for sure. But the research suggests that after maybe a year or so, lottery winners often aren't significantly happier, on average, than they were before they won. Their happiness level seems to adapt and return to their personal set point.
Huh. And does it work for bad things, too?
To some extent, yes. People are often surprisingly resilient. After experiencing negative events like disability or loss, their happiness levels often dip significantly, but then tend to gradually recover towards their baseline over time, though maybe not always fully back to where they were.
Wow. Okay, so this treadmill idea, this raises an important question. If our happiness levels tend to just reset themselves after a while, what does that mean for trying to achieve long-term happiness goals? Does it kind of undermine the whole effort?
That's the big implication, yeah. If we just adapt to better circumstances, simply chasing external achievements or possessions might not be a reliable path to lasting increases in well-being. It suggests we might need to focus on other things, maybe internal states, attitudes, or the nature of our pursuits themselves, rather than just the outcomes.
Really makes you think. Okay, so these are complex ideas with deep roots. Maybe we could briefly touch on that history. Where did all this thinking about pleasure actually start?
Oh, it goes way back. Hedonism is genuinely one of the oldest philosophical theories around. In ancient Greece, you had thinkers like Aristippus and the Cyrenaics. They were very much about immediate sensory pleasure, like right now, what feels good.
The original folk hedonists, maybe?
Sort of. But then you had Epicurus, who often gets lumped in with them, but was actually quite different. He also valued pleasure, but defined it more subtly as the absence of pain and mental disturbance. He advocated moderation, simple living, and philosophical contemplation to achieve ataraxia, a state of calm tranquility.
So less wild parties, more quiet contemplation.
Exactly. And then, of course, you had major figures like Plato and Aristotle who were critical. They didn't dismiss pleasure entirely, but they argued it wasn't the highest good. For them, pleasure had to be linked with virtue, reason, and living a flourishing human life, eudaimonia.
Okay, ancient Greece, what happened after that? Did it just disappear?
Not entirely. Though it was less prominent in the medieval period, often viewed with suspicion by dominant religious views. But you saw echoes. Maybe Augustine wrestling with earthly pleasures versus divine ones, or Aquinas talking about the ultimate pleasure being the vision of God, and interesting strands in Islamic philosophy, too.
Right. And then more recently.
It really picked up again around the Renaissance and Enlightenment. You had figures like Lorenzo Viola trying to square Christian ethics with Epicurean ideas. Then thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Hume put pleasure and pain right back at the center of human motivation and morality.
And that leads into Bentham and Mill.
Precisely. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the huge rise of classical utilitarianism with Bentham's calculus and Mill's qualitative distinctions. That really set the stage for a lot of modern ethical and political thought.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing.
No, the 20th century brought major critiques. We talked about G.E. Moore arguing for other intrinsic values besides pleasure, and Nozick's experience machine. Others pointed out problems like malicious pleasures. Is the pleasure a sadist gets from hurting someone actually a good thing to put in the utilitarian calculation?
Yeah, tricky questions.
And even today, philosophers like Fred Feldman are working on modified versions, like attitudinal hedonism, trying to refine the concept to address these long-standing challenges.
So it's clear this isn't just some dusty old philosophical debate. It seems like these ideas about hedonism in the broader sense are still really relevant today, right? Across lots of different areas.
Oh, absolutely. You see its influence everywhere once you start looking. Take positive psychology, for example. A huge chunk of that field is essentially hedonic psychology.
Really? How so?
Well, they're scientifically studying pleasant and unpleasant experiences.
Yeah.
Happiness, joy, contentment, but also sadness, anxiety.
Hmm.
They look at their biological bases, their social functions, how to cultivate positive emotions. They even study things like anhedonia, which is a clinical inability to feel pleasure, or sometimes hedonophobia, an actual fear of pleasure.
Wow, fear of pleasure. Okay. What about other fields?
Economics is another big one. Think about welfare economics. A lot of that rests on the idea that the goal of economic policy should be to promote societal happiness, often measured in terms of preference satisfaction, which links back to pleasure.
Right.
There's the whole economics of happiness movement, studying how wealth actually correlates or doesn't with subjective well-being, and even technical things like hedonic regression in pricing, trying to value a product based on the pleasure or utility its different features provide. And then there's animal ethics. We mentioned Peter Singer earlier. His influential arguments for animal welfare are deeply rooted in utilitarian hedonism. The core idea is that sentient animals can experience pleasure and pain, perhaps differently from us, but their suffering matters morally, and we should act to minimize it.
So it stretches from our own psychology to economics to how we treat other species.
Exactly. And you see echoes in popular culture too, of course, consumerism, entertainment, ideas about the good life. Even some religious traditions have concepts like Christian hedonism, arguing that finding ultimate pleasure in God is the highest aim.
So we've really covered a lot of ground here. We started with that common kind of narrow idea of folk hedonism, just indulgence, right?
Mhm.
And we've journeyed through to seeing hedonism as this really broad, quite nuanced family of philosophical ideas about the central role of pleasure and pain in how we're motivated, what we value, and how we think about morality.
Yeah.
It's really clear that hedonism, understood properly, is, well, a powerful lens for looking at human experience. It goes way beyond just simple indulgence.
Absolutely. I think this deep dive really shows just how diverse these ideas are, how influential they've been across history, and, importantly, how they're still shaping our conversations today about what it even means to live a good life.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
Well, maybe think about those psychological challenges we discussed. Consider the paradox of hedonism in your own life. Do you find that chasing happiness directly actually works for you? Or does it tend to show up more as a side effect when you're engaged in other things you care about?
Hmm.
And what about the hedonic treadmill? How does that idea resonate with your own experiences of ups and downs? And maybe more broadly, how do you personally try to balance seeking immediate pleasure or gratification with maybe longer-term goals, deeper well-being, and also, importantly, thinking about the well-being of others around you? Lots to chew on there.